we have all found ourselves to be, would you like for me to start, or are we okay up to this point? All right, so we have all found ourselves participants in this pandemic, either actively or not, willingly or not, whether working from home, those having to maintain social distance, the curfews, the lockdowns in other jurisdictions, compulsory quarantine for the infected, as well as those coming from abroad, frontline service providers, researchers, students, scientists. We are all affected and we are all in this. So therefore, while we hope that this is the last of this magnitude of problems, research, of course, suggests otherwise. We have to examine the forms and be able to evaluate the adequacy of our responses. And that, only happens if we continue to engage, if we continue to share and test our thoughts and proposals. And therefore, we have arranged to have a great discussion coming up for everyone who is present today on examining the forms and adequacy of humanitarian action during emergencies, both locally and internationally. For those starting to engage in various ways, such as research, frontline, and any other way, as well as those who have a lot of experience in the area, we hope that we will all be able to walk away from this discussion with a lot. We also invite, for every one of us to be able to share your thoughts. And because we wish to make this session as interactive as possible. And therefore, just a few things to keep in mind during the session is that anyone, whether panelist or not, can be able to submit comments, proposals, or whatever it is that you wish to share with us on Twitter. You can use our Twitter, the hashtag COVIDHAE. Our handle is at Fiscal Law Africa. And you can also share, and we can also interact on my Twitter handle at HMBOCE, MBOCE. We will try to respond to as many queries or comments as possible while online. And we also undertake that even once off, maybe for reasons of time, we'll still continue to engage. So without further ado, let's present our panelists for today. I dare say it's a very rich panel. We have, and you'll also see that we have gender balance. I'll start with John Kinuthia. Maybe John can wave at everyone else. Thanks, John. John is a lead research analyst at International Budget Partnership. So if I say IBP, I'll be referring to International Budget Partnership. We also have Pavin Ngala. Pavin, you can just wave. Thanks, Pavin. Pavin is the interim regional head of programs, Horn, East and Central Africa of Oxfam International. Thank you for joining us. We have Dr. Evelyn Asala. She's a senior lecturer at the University of Nairobi. I am not sure whether Evelyn has been able to join us yet. I cannot see her, but of course, as and when she joins us, we'll be able to engage and have her on board. We also have Clifford Talker. Clifford is the group head of corporate and regulatory affairs at Nation. So just briefly, you will note that the panel is actually quite rich. For instance, John from IBP provides technical assistance on public finance management and informs IBP's advocacy in Kenya. And of course, to achieve this, John leads IBP's Kenya's research and analysis and supports capacity building and other initiatives. So I say this because you realize these are people with, our panelists are people with both industry experience as well as research experience. It's it's quite rich in terms of the multidisciplinarity of it. And therefore, we are happy to have each one of you present. So then perhaps I will just say a bit more about Pavin Ngala of Oxfam. She's responsible for providing strategic support to countries in the Horn, East and Central African region in programs focusing on influencing and advocacy agenda and initiatives. Also, she looks at issues of program quality, strengthening linkages between humanitarian and development programs, and providing leadership to the regional programs team. So already you can see the relevance to what's having her present with us today. When Dr. Asala joins us, as I have said, we'll introduce her, but she, just briefly, she is a senior lecturer at the University of Nairobi School of Law. She holds a PhD from Witwatersrand, South Africa, and she also holds a Master's of Law degree from the University of Pretoria in South Africa. She has previously consulted with the Trust Fund for Victims of International Criminal Courts, the International Nuremberg Principles Academy, Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission of Kenya, and the Bail and Bond Task Force in Kenya. She's therefore quite a rich contributor to this particular conversation. Clifford, once again, of Nation Media Group, is a multidisciplinary leader in both private sector and with international organizations. Clifford is a specialist in legal and regulatory affairs, government relations, public policy, corporate communications, media and stakeholder management, as well as international trade and regional integration. That's a very rich panel, and we hope that we can therefore be able to draw from them. Just to acknowledge that we have our plenary managers, Ms. Brenda Wangila. She's a law student at the University of Nairobi and research assistant at Committee on Fiscal Studies. Thank you so much, Brenda. We also have Ms. Gwen Kaya. She's also a law student at the University of Nairobi and also a research assistant at the Committee on Fiscal Studies. That said, we can now then go into the plenary discussions, and perhaps we can start with you, John. Maybe you can start by sharing with us your perspectives on this topic, and then we can take it from there.
Thanks, Njoki, and the rest of the team. I have to agree that become interesting things. So having meetings actually, of course, has its advantages and disadvantages, but it's still good to be able to have these kind of conversations. So my name is John Kilothia, as introduced. I work with the International Budget Partnership, and my short presentation, just based on the kind of work that we do, will really be focused on looking at, I would say, government emergency preparedness from the perspective of public finance. And when I was thinking of, what's the best way to title my short presentation, I thought probably we should look at it from a perspective of, opportunities and missed opportunities, but really looking forward on how, as a country, we can be better prepared for such scenarios as we are dealing with right now, because we have a health pandemic now. Next time it could be flood, the other time it could be famine. So there are very many things that we cannot really always predict, but we know that they might happen, and so it's a question of how do we get prepared. I think one thing that all of us can appreciate is that regardless of what situation we face, one of the significant players and probably the leading player in any response will always be government. And so when we are looking at how is it that as a country and as a region we can be better prepared, then a question is how well are our Sorry.
Sorry, John, for that. Please, part of housekeeping is that anyone joining, kindly mute your microphone so that then we can be able to hear the speaker. John, please continue.
Okay, thanks. So I think it's a question of then how well and how prepared our governments are, and in more particular, do we have fiscal policies that help us prepare, especially resource-wise, so that anytime we deal with this type of emergencies, then from the word go, we are ready to move, even as we work through different modalities to get more resources on board. So I will not put up a PowerPoint presentation. I think we've harassed people long enough with PowerPoint presentations, so I'm just going to speak from some notes that I put down. So I'm going to speak to two things very quickly, and these two issues are basically going to be related to, first of all, looking at the fiscal policies that we have and how prepared we are in terms of setting up what I would call rainy day arrangements, and exactly where are we with that. And I will use the example of where we are today and how we saw these rainy day arrangements play out. The second aspect that I will speak is that anytime we have this type of so anytime we have this type of emergencies, then of course the question of where the most vulnerable, persons and households in the country and in the region are, then becomes quite important. And so I'll also look at Kenya's experience around social protection and how, and whether we are going far enough. And again, this will be also from a perspective of public finance. So to start off, I think it's good to appreciate that often, budgets are seen as very rigid policy instruments. And for the simple reason for this is because of just the amount of time that it takes to formulate budgets, to approve them and implement them. It takes quite a long period of time. And so there are very elaborate processes that we go through to make sure that the way our budgets are formulated and the policies and the priorities that we put in are inclusive, and they go through a process that then is agreeable to anyone. So we try, or at least that's what we always aim to do. But even in that very elaborate process, there are certain things that are emergent that we can't really budget for. And as much as we can anticipate they might happen, the nature and the cost of them is not something that we are able to prepare. And as budget persons, this is something that we are very aware of. However, the policies that we have in the country, and here I'm speaking all the way from the Constitution to the public finance management laws that we have actually do have an element that takes care of emergency and budget for. So, for example, when you look at the national government level, we have the contingencies fund, which is set up in the Constitution. At the county level, we have county emergency funds. And even when you go into different funds that we have, for example, CDF, the Constituency Development Fund, it also has a component that is supposed to be set aside just for emergencies. So, in a broad brush is to say that the way our legal frameworks are set up and the legal frameworks that deal with budgets is that we actually do have certain mechanisms that are supposed to create budget lines. That means that anytime we have emergencies, that we, from the word go, can have resources that we can go to and already start responding to the issue that we are facing at that point. But I'll also be very quick to say that the existence of budget line does not guarantee that they are resourced and they are available, and so everything is good. And I think what has happened with COVID-19 has actually been an example of how this can play out. So yes, we know there's a contingencies fund. This contingencies fund is supposed to be resourced up to 10 billion shillings. We have county emergency funds. Counties are free to spend up to 2% of their revenue on these emergency funds. So when you look cumulatively at the kind of revenue that counties had budgeted for 2019-2020, which is the financial year where we are right now, then we would have almost 9 billion shillings that would have just been readily available in that emergency fund. So I'm just sharing a screen just to show an example of this. So, the contingencies fund will have about 10 billion shillings. The county emergency funds will have about 9 billion shillings. CDF is supposed to allocate 5% of its total funding for emergencies. Even the affirmative action fund actually has an emergency component to it as well. So from the word go, even if they were not fully resourced and we had spent some of the money within the 2019-2020 year, then at least we'll have, even if it's a quarter of it, about 5 billion shillings that then will ensure that the government at both levels of government, national and county, have something to immediately respond to the kind of emergencies that we are dealing with right now. But as I say, there's definitely no guarantee that these budget lines are resourced, and it seems that in this case, and from the examples we've been hearing from some of the work that we do and the partners that we work with in some of the counties, it seems that there is no clarity and kind of coordination on how to get these funds rolling, and in some scenarios even it's been a question on whether there's actually any money that has been put in place. So this a bit calls into the role of Parliament because as an oversight body and the county assemblies of the county is a question of how much clarity do we have in terms of the coordination mechanism and whether we have actually an existing policy framework to ensure that when emergencies come out, all these funds that are in different laws can actually be coordinated in a way that then we have one national response, so that we are already taking action early enough, even as Parliament and the national, and the ministries of finance start working around where to free more resources from. So I think that's one important thing about the missed opportunity in terms of the use of these emergency funds. And the second thing is also to say there's no recourse in the laws that I described of what happens if these funds are not resourced at all. So what happens if the National Treasury has not resourced the contingencies fund up to the 10 billion shillings that the Constitution anticipates. So we really do not have a recourse, and again, this is a gap that definitely Parliament can do something to be able to solve. So going forward and anticipating that this is not the last time we'll deal with this type of emergencies, then we need to deliberate about the structure, the management, and the deployment of these funds in anticipation that future emergencies should see us respond better. And what we can do better could vary in terms of having more stringent measures in terms of how these emergency funds are resourced. So, for example, will it make sense to say that whenever we are allocating resources to the emergencies fund, it should be put together in the bracket where we have the consolidated fund services. That's our debt payment allocations, our pensions, and then we put in emergencies as one that we have to make sure is resourced well early enough when we are doing our budgeting. So in terms of the policies, definitely there are a couple of opportunities to build on, but also there are some gaps that we need to learn from, and especially in terms of how we've responded to COVID-19 from the government perspective. So on the second issue, so we know very well that anytime we have this emergency, there are vulnerable groups that get affected from day one. And this means that then we need to have safety nets that are able to protect the most vulnerable persons and households, even as we continue mapping out other groups that might become vulnerable as emergencies evolve. So Kenya has a history of social safety nets. Yes, please.
John, I'll give you 2 more minutes.
All right. That will be enough. So, Kenya has a history of social safety nets, from the ones that we have in government. So we have the orphans and vulnerable children. We have a whole social protection state department in government. But there are 2 questions that we need to think about when we speak about these social safety nets. The first one, and which came up when we were looking at the COVID-19 fund regulations that were released by the National Treasury 2 weeks ago, is first of all, is the definition of vulnerable groups wide enough to cover the full range of poor and vulnerable households? So, for example, are we including in it, the urban poor? Are we looking at scenarios where also we need to take into account poor female-headed households? I think the definition definitely means that how we respond and make sure that we don't leave any of the vulnerable groups out of the definition then becomes a very critical aspect. The second one is whether these programs are, have a wide coverage in relation to the number of poor households that we have in the country. So, for example, when you look at statistics from the Kenya National Bureau of Standards, Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, so Kenya has more than 12 million poor people, and these are people spread across 3.1 million households. But when you look at the social protection programs that we have, looking at the budget of 2018-2019, the number of households that were covered under all the social protection programs that we have was about 1.2 million households. So about 39% of the poor households we have. Of course, what happens when we have emergencies is that even people who probably were able to put food on the table in their houses, they might actually slip also into this bracket that needs to be covered. So with an allocation of 27 billion shillings to cover 1.2 million households, to be able to cover the full 3.1 million plus any other households that then will need support during this period means that then we require way more resources. And the additional resources of 10 billion shillings, for example, that were presented in the measures the President gave 2 weeks ago, means that we still do not have enough resources within the government purview to be able to cover all the households that might be vulnerable. And here, of course, some of the donor aspects come in, which is really a good thing. But I think lastly, as we speak of this, is also to make sure that we have the data and the information that we require, so that we also eliminating the risk of scenarios where there are duplication of some of these social protection programs. We know that there are some counties that have social protection programs as well that sound very similar to the ones at the national government level, but this is really a huge opportunity, the fact that Kenya has experience working with these kind of social protection programs, but there are still quite a number of issues around the definition of the vulnerable groups and also the spread of these programs generally, to be able to say that anytime we face these kind of emergencies, the poorest and most vulnerable we don't get. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And actually, you leave us with two very important questions. That one, the issue of definition of the vulnerable, and two, the second aspect of coverage in terms of our social protection programs. And therefore, I think this is the right time to bring in Parvin Gala from Oxfam to also give us perspectives, because I think most of what she will say will also touch on what John has raised. Thank you so much, Parvin.
Thank you so much, and actually it's a great sort of having been before John, because he sort of has, at least for me, set quite a good background in terms of some of the issues that I'll be speaking to. So my name is Parvin Gala. Please confirm if you can see my screen so that I know that I am at least
yes,
sharing. Yeah,
yes.
John, I will do the PowerPoint option, mostly because I'm quite visual in the way I operate. Yeah, and maybe there are some listeners who also want to see some visuals. So just balancing it out, Joanne. So I'm the regional head of programs for Oxfam, and the region I talk about is Horn East and Central Africa. We support 10 countries, and in terms of just my discussion, while I will situate a lot of my discussion in terms of this region, there's definitely things that we see which are similar, reflected in Kenya, reflected in other countries. And so it's just, on one hand, definitely consistency in terms of the way we are dealing with COVID-19 and how we should sort of think about it. So quickly looking at preparedness, response in the region, and lessons we will have to learn. And please note, I have insisted on using the word we will have to learn, from this COVID-19 pandemic. As a general, introduction in terms of the work that Oxfam does in this region, we are involved quite a bit in humanitarian interventions, mostly as a result of conflicts or or displacement, and so work with refugees, work with internally displaced populations, and also look at things to do with food insecurity. We are definitely engaged very much in terms of looking at gender justice, women's rights, and when I was looking at the CFS website today, I could see there's definitely consistency in some of the things that we see as important. And so work in the areas of women's economic empowerment. We work with women's rights organizations with regards to women's leadership. We also are quite involved in governance and active citizenship, whether we're looking at civic space organizations, looking at what is it? What is the dialogue that needs to be taking place with regards to decision making and policy? And so, even John's discussion earlier on, what are the policy issues we need to be looking at? But also in terms of sustainable livelihoods, we go at it, especially in terms of working with women and youth. Looking at how we can support in providing opportunities, very much in partnership with different organizations that improve access to different economic opportunities for them. Now, before I get into the COVID-19 specifics, what I just wanted to highlight, and I'm sure you'll agree with me, is that for this region, we are a region in crisis. When we look at the economic growth, which is unfortunately not tandem, in terms of equal. So there's a lot of inequalities that we see in both between the countries, within the countries. There's a lot of conflicts that we're perpetually having to deal with, and that's why earlier on I was talking about displacement. Ethiopia, we have South Sudan, we have Sudan. So there's a lot of things. We have rapid urbanization, and please note, even with these issues, there's definitely, I usually say, there's a dichotomy. On one hand, it can be turned into an opportunity, or we can see the learning from it and see how we can turn it into an opportunity, but that is unless they are addressed. Yeah, there's different forms of activism taking place. The other day with Sudan, when we saw the youth, the women come to the front in terms of putting voice to issues they felt they needed change in their country. A lot of us, and just by using this platform, are using social media to advocate for change. That there are things going on the continent: gender and power inequalities, climate change. We cannot sing enough about the impact on the continent, on our countries with regards to climate change, demography. The fact that for the continent, we were just saying the other day that we're nearly going to be 70% of youth, and of course I will not get into the definition of youth because in the Kenyan situation we have our own variables on it, but also debt linked to a lot of borrowing that is happening on the continent to support different programs. But on the long term of it, what is the likely impact on our economies? When I look at preparedness in the region, and coming at it as an organization that's been quite involved both in preparedness but also in response to different crises, one of the things I would say is that in terms of strength, for example, is we have experience. So DRC as an example on Ebola, that some of the mechanisms, some of the strategies that have been are being used for the COVID-19 response are based on our experience in other crises. So there's definitely that as a positive, and that also means probably the structures, and I was joking with somebody the other day who was talking about Italy and the shock that many people have had, in terms of dealing with this disease, because they aren't used to dealing with it. There's been a lot of scrambling, in terms of how to deal with it, and in itself as a lesson already for us that we are a bit ahead, so different forms of crisis. The other thing I would say is a strength is that we have quite an enterprising, population, and picking, for example, with what's been going on in Kenya, in the region, in terms of people trying to come up creatively, in terms of identifying technologies, things that we can do to support in reducing the spread of the disease. But also, I want to put here that our population, again, is comprised mostly of youth. So as compared to other countries in the West, which have been much more impacted because of the demographic dynamics that they have, and that playing whatever in terms of the case fatalities. The challenges: poor health infrastructure. Again, John spoke to it in terms of social protection systems. What do we have on the ground? When we look at the continent, we were calculating the other day, and we're saying there are 0.25 doctors per every 1,000 people, 1.4 beds in the hospitals per every 1,000 people, and this is the average on the continent, and even lower for countries, for different countries in the region. Resources in this case, moving a bit towards the financial resources, and at this point, even more significant because of the fact that the countries we typically rely on as our donors are dealing with their own populations, having to focus on their own. So we're looking more at ourselves, we're needing to look more at ourselves. And then coordination. Yes, we have experience, but we struggle with coordination. If you look at the countries in the region, Kenya included, yes, there has been an aspect where, we started setting up systems for coordination, but it's interesting when you see the dynamics at county, the differences at county level, the dynamic between what the private sector is doing, what the public, sector is doing, bringing it all together. So those are some of the things, and when I move to what we will have to learn, are important for us to consider as we look at preparedness. The resources part of it, I just wanted to also flag something. I've been involved, I've worked in the humanitarian sector for nearly 20 years, and one of the things we usually joke about is I can tell you the number of contingency plans we have. We prepare them and we put them on a shelf somewhere. More often than not, they are not resourced. We tend to wait until the crisis has happened before we take any action. So that is definitely a challenge for all of us. In terms of response, John also alluded to this in terms of the vulnerable, whatever areas. So for now, for instance, as an organization, we are choosing to focus quite a bit in terms of informal settlements or high density areas, as some countries call them, internally displaced population settlement sites and refugee settlements. Unfortunately, this is where most of our vulnerable are, mostly because the dynamic around preventing the spread of this disease is, one, linked to density in a space, but also in terms of the economic level, the income level of the communities living in these areas. So that means they are not able to, as has been mentioned, I think in the Kenyan context, if we lock down Kenya, what does that mean for many? I think the figure we've been saying is nearly 80% of our employment, as if we put it in quotes, is based out of small and medium enterprises or informal sort of sector. So if you lock down, what does that mean for populations living in these areas? And the other part of it being that these are the areas where they don't have access to safe water and hygiene materials. So that needs to be a special focus. I was looking at some of the figures. We were saying in urban areas, typically, only 5% of the population in informal settlements accesses the water services that is supposed to be available. Focus actions so far from the response, a big part of it has been about...
I'll give you 3 more minutes.
3 minutes, okay, thank you. Community engagement, hygiene awareness, water and sanitation provision. And then approaches, definitely about partnerships, definitely about, what are the different mechanisms. For instance, right now we're talking about cash transfers, electronic vouchers, different mechanisms, not just, some of the traditional things that we tend to do. My last point is on the lessons we will have to learn. One, we're interdependent, the fact that all of us have a role to play, and we realize more and more as has emerged from this COVID outbreak that we are interdependent. We need to build on each other's sort of skill sets, and we are only as strong as our weakness, as our weakest. The weakest being those, for instance, in informal settlements. If we do not look at mechanisms that, whether it's the social protection systems, whether it's the targeting systems, whether it is, the distribution mechanisms that are being set up in these areas, if they don't have water, that person who comes to work in the middle income or high income area then poses a risk to this supposed strong people. So we are only as strong as our weakest, and we need to consider how we support those who are weak in our community. But we do not stop with this crisis. NGOs look at, right now, we're looking at building of local humanitarian capacity, because we can't keep relying on external, support. We have to look at what the local capacity is. Governments, what are the systems we are setting up? The social protection system, the safety net systems, private sector. There's no business as usual because of the fact that everything stops if our most vulnerable are not supported. So, yeah, those are the lessons that I'd like to highlight. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Pavin, and to see that you have actually, fed and plugged into the discussion that John had earlier introduced. And thank you also for sharing with us the slides. Your slides and John's slides with respect to giving us all the numbers really work very well to complement each other. And we're already beginning to see the linkage, even in terms of what is happening, what various stakeholders such as Oxfam are doing, what IBP is doing. And one of the things that I really like in terms of what you have highlighted is, speaking to what John has said in terms of the problem of definition of who the vulnerable are. And you have given one very important parameter of those within informal settlements, and you have also gone on to give us other parameters. So thank you very much for that. And you also bring in and have been able to discuss a very important aspect, the justice angle of it, even in terms of, as you're looking at the special focus area. So perhaps this then is the right point to bring in Dr. Evelyn Asala, who is a lecturer at the University of Nairobi. Dr. Asala, can you hear me? Dr. Asala?
I can hear you, Mboshe. Can you hear me?
Thank you so much. And now we're very keen to hear your insights on this particular debate, especially having heard what John has said from the budgeting perspective, what Pavin has shared with us now from a humanitarian intervention perspective. We will be keen to hear what you have to say.
I'm most privileged to share this panel with the experts in humanitarian area and in different sectors. I think from my perspective as an expert in international criminal justice, I find there is a lacuna in the sense that most of the interventions and approaches, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Okay. Most of the interventions, as you can see, we have most of the people in the thing. There is an exclusive kind of focus on the measures to address and respond to the pandemic or to humanitarian actions. But I think it's also important to realize that we live in a multi-sectoral and multidisciplinary society, and therefore we need a holistic kind of response to pandemics or humanitarian action. And John mentioned about the need to target, as well as Pavin, about the vulnerable population. But when you listen to them, they are more focused on the economically marginalized in the society. But we also forget that we have people who are marginalized in different senses, given that our society is multi-sectoral. And for example, I want us to think of, with my background, I want us to think of people who are deprived their liberty, for example. People within the criminal justice sector. We can clearly see there are two ways in which the criminal sector is key and needs a response whenever we are with a humanitarian situation like what we are in today. For example, first, we can see there is an increase in crime. There are different ways in which people have devised to perpetuate crime. And second, we can also see there is a continuous abuse of fundamental rights within the criminal justice system. So let me look at the first aspect of increase in crime. How has pandemic increased crime in the society, and has there been adequate responses? When you look at the way this pandemic came into our society, of course, now no one was expecting this. There are no measures in society to respond, and I don't blame our government for having, seeking solutions or adopting measures to deal with the spread and to target people that have already been affected. But I think also we were also totally unprepared as governments, and something we need to look into going forward in other areas of law. For example, we have seen a lot of increase in property crimes. First, with respect to people who just take advantage of the situation. We are not criminals, but because this is happening, people are in panic, let us take advantage and engage in criminal acts within our society. Yeah, and there are those also who are reacting to the harsh economic conditions. Maybe Kenya may not have experienced this at a large scale, but when you see other societies outside there that have faced lockdowns for a long time and total lockdowns, not in the partial sense that we are experiencing in Kenya, then people get worn out, and because of the difficult economic times, people engage in economic crime. You have to break into a shop, you have to break into a supermarket to get your daily feed. And this maybe informs the decision why government had to adopt a curfew for those who are opportunistic and are taking advantage of the situation, especially in the night. You want to rob your neighbor's house, you want to take advantage and hijack vehicles on the road. And therefore, there are some of these measures that government have the spread and responding to the pandemic have made the public react in ways that are criminal in nature. The other way is the lacks that we can just experience in the enforcement of law, especially criminal law in Kenya. The other day I saw a clip on social media where a candy shop, is publicly selling drugs to under 18 kids. Yeah. And no one is bothered about this. It's happening in broad daylight, and children are buying and abusing drugs in broad daylight. And I think, of course, every mechanism now is focused on, tracing. It's focused on stopping the spread of the virus. But again, we are also forgetting that even though what we are doing is important, we also need to respond to other areas and to create kind of ceilings so that we don't allow crime to go on, and many other sectors that might also be affected in different ways. So this is just a discussion, perhaps to create some light and enable governments to notice that in as much as it's important to respond to the pandemic, it's also important to cushion other areas that remain exposed. Then we have also violent crimes are rising. We may not have had any statistics in public, maybe because of the nature of our enclosed society, but you will agree with me there is an increase in domestic violence cases. Yeah, we have domestic violence happening at a very high rate at homes now that everyone is locked in the house. Maybe in the Kenyan society, we may not have gotten statistics, but I'm sure in South America, we have all seen what is happening and the number of injuries that are rising every single day because of this kind of measures that governments are adopting. Yet, it looks as though government did not foresee some of these happenings and therefore did not create possible reactions or possible ways of addressing them whenever they arise. Then the other way in which the criminal justice system is being affected is abuse of fundamental rights. I know all of us are aware that we have people who had been arrested. There are those who are in remand. There are those who have ongoing cases that have now been suspended indefinitely. There are those who've been convicted and they were also willing to appeal or get some kind of liberty at the end of the justice system. But now what happens with this pandemic is that people have been condemned to unlawful confinement. Yeah, you can imagine if someone was in remand because they were unable to pay their bail or seek their liberty as their cases were ongoing, then it means this person will be in remand for as long as the COVID situation, comes to an end, which none of us knows when the system will be up and running in the normal sense. Therefore, there is a way in which I do not want to blame anyone or any institution in this, but it's something that all of us have gotten into. We didn't expect, and therefore we may not have put up appropriate measures to react to them. But this is something going forward that our systems need to bear in mind and provide for, and therefore protect the fundamental rights of those of us who are in the criminal justice system. Yeah, and also, I'm sure as much as we have all these kind of reactions at the local level, the same is happening at the international level. Yeah, I'm sure we have heard of the Yemen crisis and the complaints in Iraq about the sanctions of the UN Security Council, which are even inhibiting the ability of the government to acquire facilities to deal with this pandemic. So, and no one can blame the Security Council. They may not have foreseen such a thing, but again, it goes back to the preparedness that we need to put in place in order to deal with such humanitarian actions whenever they happen. So I think within the criminal justice sector, there is a lot that needs to be done. Most of the interventions that are needed, none has been put in place. There is no response measure. I agree with the previous speakers. A lot of the measures that have been taken are in direct response to the pandemic itself, but we also need to think of the other disciplines within society which leaves other vulnerable groups very exposed. And thinking of the prison, for example, you can imagine the outbreak. I thank the government for having locked down visits to prisons. You can imagine if we have a breakdown, a spread of this virus within the prison sector, how devastating it will be. Yeah, so I think it's important that when we think and forge for ways forward, we also think of other sectors or include persons from other sectors that can provide their input and expertise on how to make sure that we offer the society a holistic approach to humanitarian action. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. for that, and particularly for drawing out the tragedy in the linear or silo approach to looking at pandemics, and drawing everyone's attention to the fact that if we continue to just focus on the pandemic of the day, such as COVID, then we may neglect other areas and then end up in a situation of constant firefighting. You also raised the very important issue of even in terms of reporting and how all these things are happening. And therefore, perhaps this is the right point to bring in Clifford Machoka, who is the group head of corporate and regulatory affairs at Nation Media Group. Clifford?
Thank you very much, Njoki. I think I would first want to thank everyone, and it's actually very humbling to be amongst this panel. I don't know whether everyone can hear me.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
thank you
can.
very much. Yeah, I think we've already done the introduction, Njoki, so I'll just try to save my 10 minutes so that I can speak as much as I can. But I think my focus would be mostly on the role of corporates in emergency preparedness. How have corporates been able to prepare for emergencies, and then also I'll link it to media as a sector and what has been our role in emergency preparedness and the role that we currently play even during this crisis, and what are the key lessons that we can learn. So I do not have a presentation to share, but I'll just share my thoughts around it, and then we'll be able to take it from there. I think for corporates, the key thing that I think this emergency preparedness that has brought out is that we think we are prepared, but we're not. Most of the corporates, we prepare through what you call business continuity plans. And I think what was quite interesting is to see that most of the business continuity plans were put in the shelves and have not been revisited in a very long time. So the virus actually caught a lot of private sector unawares. Those who started planning most probably started planning 2 to 3 weeks beforehand. Others were caught when the president made the announcement, and therefore that's the time you start thinking of how do I handle my employees, how do I handle safety, what are the logistical support that I need to provide, and how do I ensure my business can continue during such a crisis, which for corporates is a very important thing, especially corporates that most probably have not really looked at the digital side of things, and they're mostly through human interactions. I think that aspect was a very key learning for corporates, that the business continuity plans had not been updated and had not foreseen some of these emergencies. And therefore, going back and very quickly trying to look at these areas, on our part, and I think for me, it's actually a big shortfall and something that was a key learning for us. I think what we have seen during this crisis is that it's very important to look through and maybe foresee into the future what happens when an emergency that can come to the point that it cuts off your operations. And if it cuts off your operations, then the key thing is that how do you operate in such a circumstances, and how do you then bounce back? Because the key thing about business continuity is not only operating during such a circumstance, but it's also how do you recover from such a pandemic situation. And I think it's something that both private sector and public need to look at, because I think sometimes we focus so much on a reactionary approach to emergencies, and therefore we deal with, for example, right now we're dealing with coronavirus as it is. What I'm wondering is that whether, even from a public sector perspective, we're actually thinking of recovery. What do we need to do to be able to recover, and how will we recover? What are the priority sectors that we need to focus on to recover? And having those strategies in place, even while we are having parallel strategies in place to deal with the pandemic. I think it's very important to look at, because private sector is able to do both at the same time. Right now, a lot of private sectors are actually looking at, if we were in this for 3 to 6 months, once the 6 months is over, what do we need to do to be able to jumpstart our operations back up? I think we've seen that private sector have taken a lot of approaches in terms of cushioning their employees. We've seen that some private sector have really tried to avoid the aspect of sending people home. But that's not the case for SMEs. I think we've seen SMEs have really been hardest hit, whereby the fact of the matter is that they do not have the cushioning power that big corporates may have, and therefore they've had to send their people home. But even for big corporates, there are a number of approaches that have been taken. I think the natural action has been, how do we pass the benefit to employees? So if you look at maybe pay cuts, but even pay cuts, what corporates have done is to say, can the management take a higher pay cut than the mid-level management? And if the mid-level management and management take pay cuts, then can we be able to cushion the shop floor staff, so that you actually avoid a situation where everyone has to take a pay cut? So you actually have the people who earn the most taking the huge amounts of pay cuts, and we've seen that with Kenya Airways. We've seen that with a lot of media houses now and a lot of corporates, where you have management taking between 30 to 80% pay cut, but it doesn't necessarily trickle to the employees who are the most vulnerable in the business. We've also seen an interesting approach that people take leave, but is what is called a working leave, and therefore you're taking leave because you're reducing the liability of the business, because remember, leave translates into money in corporates, but in that leave you're actually working. A good example is I've taken 15 days leave, but I'm still working, so it's a working leave. And the whole idea is to ensure that we actually reduce the liabilities of the business. And it's possible that at the end of this crisis, all of us would have taken all our leave days, and in December you'll see Nairobi being full of cars and people working. So those are some of the approaches that has been taken. Another approach is definitely unpaid leave, but I see unpaid leave as being almost the last resort. But if we're in this crisis for a while, we'll be seeing that coming to fruition. We've also seen private sector sort of coming in to supplement the efforts of government, whether it is through donations. We've seen various private sector coming in and saying, I will be able to provide sanitizers with the likes of EABL, and saying we will focus on these vulnerable communities because we know that they do not have the capability or to be able to get some of these measures that government has put in place. But I think also another thing we've seen is the Kenya COVID Fund that has been implemented by government, which was sort of borrowing from what was happening in South Africa by the private sector, where the private sector comes together and says, can we create a fund so that we can supplement the effort? So you have the Kenya COVID Fund, which is run mostly by private sector and captains of industry. And the Kenya COVID Fund then looks at the priorities areas of two priority areas, which is one, provision of medical equipment and facilities, and also support to vulnerable communities with their immediate needs, especially food and non-food items. I think in the next, I'm also involved in that fund, and in the next couple of day or two, we're going to see a big announcement in terms of what private sector has been able to come on board. I think it's very interesting because it's different from Kenya for Kenyans, where we brought in the whole country to be able to put in what they could. But the realization is that you now have Kenyans who are going through a very difficult economic times, and therefore it's very difficult for you to ask someone to put in 50 shillings or to put in 100 shillings. But there is an opportunity there for corporates to be able to come in, because that's the only way that corporates have the license to operate in this market. The fact of the market is that we operate within a society, and therefore when the right time comes, corporates need to be able to come on board and participate in some of these funds. I think the challenge in looking at these approaches is sustainability of these funds or sustainability of these approaches. I think what you've seen is that some of these funds are very reactionary. So we have coronavirus, the fund comes in, and then that's it. You know, we do not have a fund that looks at if tomorrow, and I think it's John who was alluding to this, that if tomorrow we don't have coronavirus and we have, for example, flooding disaster, what happens? And we've seen in various instances where we have disasters in different parts of the country, and we really struggle to be able to come on board and provide the necessary assistance that is required. I think also from a media perspective, what has been quite interesting is media taking a forefront role in being able to educate and inform the public. I think we've seen a number of emergency situations which have been involved in, is where the media actually goes to where the emergency situation is happening, whether it is flooding. In the current COVID, one of the things that media has really done, although there are areas of improvement, is to be able to drive a lot of awareness on the prevention measures that needs to be put in place. So you've seen a lot of media houses, for example, running public service announcements. And interesting, in the law, that is actually provided under the Kenya Information Communications Act, where the government is able to run public service announcements for free in the media houses. But we've also seen proactively the media themselves and actually educating and informing the public. I think we've also seen a situation where media houses are also playing a very important role as the public watchdogs. So we saw situations where counties are actually misappropriating their funds when buying very simple things like jerrycans, as in when you have a county buying a jerry can for 10,000 shillings, it's preposterous. But most of these things are only able to come out when the media is playing their rightful watchdog role of being able to look at how are these funds being spent. So if you have the Kenya COVID Fund and we say we've raised a amount of money, and the question that is in the minds of Kenyans would be, okay, you raised 20 billion, for example. Where was it used? Was it used effectively? Was it used for the right purpose? And did it go to the right people? And I think that's a very critical role that the media does. Because without that, then it's very possible for us to have all these funds, but no one is really looking at how they're being spent. I think maybe to summarize is to look at what are the lessons that we have learned during this process. One is from corporates is really early preparation, really putting some research and resources around business continuity plans. I think a lot of corporates have realized that that is a key component of planning, which a lot of corporates had taken for granted. So early preparation is very important for any particular kind of emergencies. Two is during these emergencies, how do we cushion our employees? As in, most of the corporates have had to innovate during this time and say, how do we go about it? But I think early preparation looks at these areas, because if we are not able to cushion our employees, then it becomes a very difficult thing to be able to recover as a business. Three is sustainability of the programs and the funds. I think we are sometimes good at coming up with these funds, and sometimes we really as a country have a spirit of giving and we rally each other to these funds. But question is, some of these funds should actually be almost like an endowment fund, a rolling fund that should anyway be there and can be contributed by both public and private sector, so that we're actually prepared for some of these emergencies. And last, I think it's the gaps that we've seen on emergency preparedness. I think emergency preparedness, I think this has been alluded also by one of the speakers, is that it's very unidimensional. So private sector just plans as private sector. Civil society plans as civil society. Public sector then plans as public sector. It's very rare you have strategies which incorporate a multi-sectoral approach to emergencies. And the fact of the matter is that emergencies impact everyone. It doesn't matter whether you are private sector, whether you're a big corporate, whether you're an SME, whether you're an NGO, whether you're civil society, whether you're public. And the question that we need to start asking ourselves is that how do we come together, leverage on our synergies, bring on board some of our key strengths, and being able to develop long-term sustainable strategies. The problem also we have is that corporates also look at aspects very short-term. So we are based on a financial year. So it becomes very difficult to tell someone, can you plan between 3 and 5 years? But I think when you have the multi-sectoral approach, then there's also some realization on some of these stakeholders that we need to start looking at emergency preparedness from a long-term approach and not just a short-term approach. And that's why, it's quite interesting when you see countries like the Obama administration putting in place a pandemic office. Who would have thought that? Why would you, if it was in Kenya, the first thing we'd ask is, why are you setting up a pandemic office? Or why are you setting up a pandemic authority? But that's the kind of foresight that I think this emergency preparedness needs. I think you see that we have a disaster sort of preparedness authority, but the question is it multi-sectoral? Is it really working? Very many times we've seen the kind of sort of weaknesses that disaster authority has. And those weaknesses can actually be able to be cured by bringing that multi-sectoral approach to emergency preparedness.
Thank you so much, Clifford, for the insights that you've been able to share with us. And it's interesting to see how all the comments the panelists are making are looping into each other, and especially the cross-cutting issue of the silo approach, and that if we continue to look at issues even the pandemics, just from the COVID scenario, then it means that we will be more reactive as opposed to the proactivity in being able to then have plans in place before the tragedies hit. So thank you very much for that. And it fits very well also to what Parvin was saying on the issue of the fact that we have a lot of potential, we have a lot of capacity. But then if we are not able to harness it in a manner then that we are all able to think about these things together, we may have a problem in terms of that. And it's the same issue that also was raised in terms of the definition of the vulnerability, that if it's just one sector, and this was raised, this was very well raised by John, that if we just look at it only from the media perspective, from the academic angle, if we look at it only in that particular manner, then we will find that we also have our own kind of challenges in terms of who are we going to assist and who does not deserve or who should not be assisted. So thank you very much for those cross-cutting contributions that you have made. And it's actually one of the, if we could very well quick just go into the questions that have been raised. I see one issue, especially on that aspect of proactivity, and I'll raise this with Dr. Asala just to give Clifford a chance to catch his breath. Someone raises a question and says that, let me pick this up, that legislation is, where is that? And this is addressed to Dr. Asala. Legislation is meant to be proactive, acknowledging that the government was not prepared and that Parliament has taken over 30, and the Parliament over 30 days after our first case has not published a single legislation. So question to Dr. Asala, what can the humanitarian and CSO world do to push Parliament to legislate? This question is by Sumaya. Thank you very much, Sumaya. Maybe Dr. Asala, if you can respond to that.
Okay, thank you very much for the question. I think legislation is the beginning point of all these response mechanisms that we are trying to put forth. And I do agree that we need a legislation. Just to point out that I know there is a bill in the offing on a proposed bill on management of humanitarian actions or emergencies like the coronavirus. And I know this is a beginning point. So I'm sure once the bill comes forth for discussion, then the public, of course, can air their views, make their contributions. And I think that's the point where all these multi-sectors should come in and make a contribution on how their areas should be covered whenever there is an emergency.
Thank you so much. Again, calling on the collaborative aspect that people need to come together and look into that. And also thank you to everyone else who is sending questions and comments. Please keep them coming. This question goes to Parvin. With different donors and NGOs taking a number of initiatives, and it links also to what the presenters have spoken about, the panelists. With different donors and NGOs taking a number of initiatives to respond to COVID in Kenya, are there mechanisms in place to ensure different actors respond proactively, that they complement efforts of each other and avoid duplication of efforts? Basically, the participant says, a cluster coordination mechanism that ensures effective information flows with a central coordination and transparency of initiatives, as has been highlighted by Clifford as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. What I'm seeing, picking on Kenya as an example, is especially for COVID, the mechanism for coordination is very much linked with the Ministry of Health and also WHO. Typically, what we have in the cluster mechanism is designated sort of agencies that support depending on what the crisis is. So for instance, if you're talking about drought, we have a national drought, mechanism in place, but in this case being a health crisis, it is definitely linked to to Ministry of Health, yeah, and also with support now from WHO and UNICEF. So that being the case, what's been happening is there've been meetings on at least from my understanding weekly basis where agencies are connecting in terms of what is happening, where are you doing. So they typically have this 4W mechanism, where, what, who, and things like that, yeah. But I think, and which is why I think it was very interesting, when it was shared earlier, I think over the weekend we had this circular by the government about coordination of private whatever contribution towards aid, because of the fact that coordination still is a challenge. You know, yes, we can see development aid agencies are doing something. We can see the private sector are doing some different things, or things that complement that, but the coordination element of it is really critical. So yes, there are efforts, but I think a lot more can be done in terms of bringing all these different sectors to the table in a way that is comprehensive. And I mention this because of the fact that we definitely run a big risk of duplication. We definitely run the risk, as Professor was saying, with regards to opportunists, you know, saying, deciding, you know what, I'll take this. There's those who will take 5 batches as opposed to just the 1 batch that is needed. So needing to bring all this together. But I mentioned that with a bit of a caveat, because sometimes whenever we say central, command central can also be an impediment in itself in terms of ease of movement, quick access. So definitely recognizing and making sure that the different sort of sector players are on the table.
Thank you. John, maybe linking also to what Pavin has just shared, and as well as all the other speakers, there's a question as to what is what's the intersection between revenue allocation for development expenditure and emergency financing is.
Okay. All right. So when that's a very budget question. So when you think about development budgets in the language that we use them when we do government budget, here you are really thinking about capital expenditure. So we need to build a road. We know where the road can be built. We have an idea about which contractors have the capability to do it. So it's something that we can actually plan. So in a way, you can say that there is a contribution that development budgets can do in terms of making sure we are prepared to deal with emergencies. But emergency itself and the resources that you need to have in place to respond to emergencies, and especially when these emergencies, of course, are always very unpredictable, then there you are really speaking of a kind of a different line. And I really like, for example, the example that Clifford gave of we should not just have this in mind the moment an emergency happens is when we are starting to scramble. It's to actually have something that is rolling over time so that anytime an emergency pops up, we've already thought about it. We have data that tells us where probably the biggest impact will be, where the biggest communities that will be affected might be living. So there's a slight difference in terms of development and emergency funds. And I think for the emergency funds, the main difference is that one is a rainy day fund. We're just preparing that in case something comes up that we cannot plan for, like building a road, that from day one we're able to respond, even as we mobilize other resources to be able to show that up.
Thank you. So Clifford, then the question has come up whether, in terms of a recommendation, whether the private sector could have an emergency continuity fund based on the surpluses, so then they are not proactive. So then they are proactive as opposed to reactive. Will that, Clifford, do you think that is a practical proposal or?
Yeah, I think we might have to have a fund that brings together both public and private sector, because then what you're looking at is having a fund that is proactively being contributed by different partners. So you could have development partners, private sector, public sector, but then ensuring that they are strict adherence to the governance structures or around transparency and accountability on those funds. And therefore, it's a situation whereby private sector will never say no to contribute to such a fund. I think the most important deterrence to private sector is that if I put in 1 million shillings, will it be used for the intended purposes? Is it being governed by people who I can trust? Is it, do we, once it is used, do we have a level of that accountability and transparency? So my suggestion would be to have a fund that brings together different stakeholders and sort of has an initial sort of, you could say, capital injection from all these, and then you actually have a rolling over fund. And that rolling over fund then is contributed by private sector, by sort of a multi-sector. I think, unfortunately, sometimes we're very suspicious of government for the reasons that all of us know. And therefore, it's just important that you actually have people who, when society looks at who's managing that fund, there is a sense of believability that these are the people who I can give my 50 shillings, and that 50 shillings will be able to go for the intended purposes.
Thank you. Again, raising the accountability question, but acknowledging the comment on just contributions from all the sectors. And perhaps, Clifford, then you can also respond to the question on, because you did make a point on the aspect of continuity and the ability for corporates, and the private sector to bounce back after all this. And we know that today is COVID, tomorrow may be something else. So the question then is, that has been asked is, we have seen other governments, we have also seen, for instance, what has happened in China, that Wuhan was locked down for quite a while. Do you think our government and corporates are prepared for such moments?
So my honest opinion is I think corporates are more prepared than government because corporates and maybe even development partners are very agile and they could easily be able to prepare these plans and actually implement them. What I would be a little bit more concerned is the aspect around government preparedness. And I think it comes to that aspect of BCP plans should not be the recluse of only corporates. A business continuity plan should almost be like a national continuity plan. So we should be able to take it up from the localized level, the corporate level, all the way to the national level. And the question is whether we actually have a proper continuity plan for Kenya. So ensuring that it's not only done by corporates, but it's something that even governments have thought through. And I think the governments who've been able to think through a continuity plan, and you can see how China has found a way to bounce back really quickly. And most probably they found a way to bounce back really quickly because they must have thought through some of these plans and what are we going to do around it. And I think that's something that we then must be able to link up. I think the answer to the question is, I think from a national perspective, it's difficult to see how a government like ours or third party or third world sort of countries are able to bounce back. But bouncing back, it's possible. It just requires preparation and early preparation. What we need to do is actually put in place those structures, resources, and those multi-sectoral approaches that can be able to plan in advance. I think that is the biggest gap that is currently not only in this country, but in different countries across the world. And that's why you see that it becomes very difficult to be able to bounce back, or we then become reactionary even when it comes to matters of how do we cushion SMEs, how do we cushion the private sector, how do we cushion the country as a whole. These are things that if thought through earlier on, as soon as this comes in place, if you look at a typical business continuity plan, is you're preparing for three scenarios: a current scenario, an amber scenario, and a red scenario. And if I look at what we have done during COVID, is that we ensure that in each of those scenarios, we actually had plans in place and we actually had trigger points. And the trigger point was if we had a government announcement from scenario A, then we start moving into scenario B, which looks at aspects of quarantining our employees. What do we have to do in terms of cushioning them? Do we need to take our employees who are producing the paper and producing the news to a different secure location? And then if we now have a complete lockdown, and then that moves into scenario number 3, which is the high scenario. So we also need governments to have that kind of planning that says, these are the scenarios. For example, right now, what the government would easily have put in place is if we do a complete lockdown. Okay, if we do a complete lockdown, have we mapped out all the vulnerable sections of our society? Are we able to deliver food? And if we're not able to deliver food, do we have the logistical arrangements between private sector and public sector to be able to do that?
So thank you so much for that. And Pavin, linking what Clifford has said and acknowledging the comments that we've been hearing all over the place about, government and whether or not government was prepared and how much government has been able to do, but then acknowledging that government does not operate alone and that we all have a role to play. Would you then, Pavin, say, do you think that corporates as well as international organizations have done enough during this particular time to complement government efforts? So then the exposure is not too high. So the person commenting says some have offered some support, but they expect, that more can be done. Or is it an unfair indictment on the corporates and international organizations?
Well, I think in terms of done enough, we'll only say when flattened the curve. So we haven't reached there. There still needs to be done for us to get.
Sorry, Pavin.
Sorry. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Sorry. I forget. Yeah. No, just saying that I don't think we can say we've done enough until that point at which we have flattened the curve. That there's definitely a lot that will still need to be done until we get to that point where we can comfortably, or at least to some element, say we've done enough. Yeah. A group that I've actually just been thinking about is, for instance, philanthropists. Crowdfunding. I know we have different experiences with regards to crowdfunding, and when people talks about accountability, that we have different experiences around this. So the accountability mechanisms really are important. It's the same issues we are facing as development agencies, where our donors are saying, okay, fine. So if we are channeling this to the government, what does that mean? What are the accountability mechanisms being put in place? The other thing I just wanted to flag, which was raised earlier with regards to resources that can be put, aside for response, is I really feel, and I'd like to emphasize, that it's important that we invest in our preparedness. And when I talk about preparedness, it's a sort of recognition in terms of what are our vulnerable spots. Yeah, when we're talking about whether it's informal settlements, whether it's the prisons, whether it is the displaced location places, these are our vulnerable spots. How do we reduce the vulnerability in those areas? With that, in terms of infrastructure, what are the basic things that are needed so that if we are responding to a crisis, our focus is not on getting water that they should already have been getting in the first place, but that we would now be focusing to a higher level in terms of the disease element. But right now, we are doing partly what we should have been doing all along, making sure that these different areas, these different communities, vulnerable communities, have access to services that they should have had all along. You muted yourself, Joanne.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, Thank you so much, Pavin. And maybe now this is the right time to call in John. to respond to the question of when Pavin tells us that we need to prepare, we need to identify our weakest link. So then if something happens, we can be able to very quickly, one, act before what happens. And so then we are not, instead of addressing problems, we are first addressing historical issues that perhaps we would have prepared ourselves, to mitigate whatever problems that we experience. So someone is asking, is there, in terms of, are there efforts to have clear data on the vulnerable and who is trying to reach them? So then we can avoid the problems that Pavin and everyone else is talking about, and also so that we can avoid duplication and at the same time expand the coverage so that everyone is reached, as Dr. Sala was saying, that, so that we can stop assuming that the pandemic is only affecting one group of people. Is there a way to be able, and I know you did highlight the challenge in definition, but is there a way, is there something that we are doing in terms of data collection?
So I would say we've made progress probably over the last 10 years, and especially when we started putting in place the safety net programs that we currently have. I think we've even gone beyond just, figuring out where how many poor people we have poor households we have in the country, and so on. If you look at the criteria that is used for identification and targeting of these vulnerable groups, it's pretty detailed, which means that definitely we have a methodology of putting this data together. And I am one person who believes that KNBS actually has been making efforts in the last couple of years to really pull together quite a lot of data. We have a poverty survey that we do every 5 years. We have a census that we do every 10 years. We have a health survey that we do every 5 years. So there are lots of pieces of data all over the place. What I would say the challenge has been is getting all these data put in a form that it speaks to some of the plans that, for example, Clifford was speaking to. And I think that is the next step that we really need to make, so that when we are faced with scenarios like we have now, we have a very clear idea about where the poor are, where they live. Somebody was giving an example today of Rwanda and saying Rwanda is so mapped out to a point that even houses have government-given house numbers. So anytime when we say we need to move into Kibera, not only do we know how many houses are there, but we actually know which sections or which wards within Kibera we need to go to first, which we need to go to second and third, and so on. So I would say we've made quite some progress in terms of putting data together. However, we need to think a little bit more in terms of how do we make sure that the data speaks to what we are preparing for.
Well, John, one would have thought, we seem to have been making efforts towards mapping through the Huduma number. So I don't know how far we have gone in terms of that. Maybe we'll be ahead of Rwanda. But just Clifford, a suggestion has been raised here that perhaps in order to raise money, more money, someone suggests that there's need to tap into the gambling appetite of Kenyans. That they say use the platform to raise money and also educate the community on dangers of corona and resilience. This is from Flora.
Yeah, I think I've seen it and I've even responded to it.
Sorry, I don't know. Just proceed, Clifford.
Okay. Yeah. I think I've seen it and I've even responded to it. I think it's an interesting suggestion, and I think any suggestion on how we can raise money is something that is welcome. The only thing that I would put a caution on gambling is the unintended adverse social impact it has on society. I think there are many other alternative ways of raising money. If you look at the way Kenya for Kenyans, we raise money, we're able to raise more than 700 million. We didn't need gambling to be able to raise that kind of money. I think we need to be able to tap onto our strength as Kenyans. We really have a really high level of giving. And if you look at around the continent, Kenyans are actually known to give. But I think Gambling might be difficult because what you're doing is that you're also creating a system of vulnerability to the vulnerable sections of society. We know what gambling has done to our young people, and that's why you see the measures that government has taken against gambling. So I wouldn't go down the route of gambling, but I think it's to be able to incorporate different other alternatives of funding. As in, if you look at various places around the world, you have either competitions, you have corporates, you have individuals who actually also contribute. You have also rolling funds. So you have situations where, maybe John can allude to this, if government was supposed to spend money on certain projects and those projects did not materialize, that money can, rather than coming back to the government, it can go to an emergency fund. 2 weeks ago, we saw the Office of the Director of Public Prosecution submitting $2 billion to the Kenya COVID Fund and saying these are the proceeds of corruption. So you could also say all proceeds of corruption will go to the fund, or any money that is actually recovered from corruption. So I think there are various ways of raising it. We just need to be careful that we don't use something that would have unintended consequences. On the media, continuing creating awareness, we have continued, and I think it's something that we will continue creating awareness around coronavirus. One of the things that we have done, for example, at NMG, is created a campaign called the Safe Nation Campaign, where we are pro bono, raising awareness on washing hands, how to wear a mask, how to sanitize yourself. So these are things that media houses are doing across the country, and something that will continue.
Thank you so much for that. Just coming back to you, Pavin, someone says that we have, in the healthcare sector, we have seen a kind of blockage, or shall I say, suspension of treatment of other diseases just because of COVID-19. They say last evening there was a story of cancer patients suffering in India for being sidelined. How can humanitarian action help with this? This is by Leslie Kale. And sorry, I'm directing this one to you. It was, I think, intended for Dr. Sala, but we have lost her due to technical problems. So I'm sure you're well able to respond.
Yeah. I think one of the things, and you remember in one of my past slides, I talked about the region in crisis, that there are very many other crises that we are still dealing with and cannot afford to take the attention away from. That, in fact, COVID only serves to exacerbate some of these issues. So two things. One is definitely keeping an eye on them and making sure that we are advocating, putting voice out there in terms of the fact that these issues are still need to be addressed, and linked also to that is resources to support that. So for instance, right now, I'm sure many of us have forgotten that we have a locust invasion in the region, and that has a major impact on our food security, which we are having to substantially rely on now because of the fact that with many people not working, we are even more ill-disposed in terms of if we have insecurity in the food insecurity in the region, and that all these things have trickle effects. So yes, I think that the element is now about keeping an eye on the other crises that we still need to support. So, for instance, one of the things as Oxfam we are doing together with other agencies is advocating with the governments with regards to what we are calling humanitarian corridors, in terms of supply chain, for whether it is medicines, whether it is personal protective equipment supposed to support this, but also for workers, who are still needed. As in Kenya, we're calling them essential workers, but that certain critical things must not stop. In fact, must be more supported because we're made more vulnerable by COVID.
Indeed, thank you so much. And Dr. Sala, we are glad to have you back. Dr. Sala, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Jackie. Sorry. I'm having a lot of technical problems.
Not a problem, not a problem. We are happy to have you back. So there's this question of, are we in a moral dilemma that puts an already stretched system into further strain? And what criteria would we use to begin to adopt a more inclusive framework? Are there any best practices? And I think this speaks to, you remember you spoke to the aspect of the justice system and saying that we have people who are in custody and they have been affected, people whose cases have not been able to go on. And for that reason, then they are so in their state of limbo and releasing them out to the world. So, are we in a state of moral dilemma?
Yeah, thank you very much, Njoki. Of course, there is the question of morality and legality. From a legal perspective, of course, this is a moral problem because once it is not written down in law, it cannot be a legal problem. Yeah, and therefore that's why the society has to respond. And I thank the first question that came in. We need a legislation as a proactive action. And once we have a legislation, now bringing on board all these concerns from the society, then it makes it a legal problem and it ceases to be a moral question that is not enforceable under the law. So we need legislation to change the moral question into a legal question that we can now enforce under the law. And once we have these issues dealt with in law, then we have the opportunity to now, attend to them and maybe foresee. Of course, it's not possible for the law to foresee every circumstance, but it is possible that we can capture what we have seen so far and make sure that whenever such situations arise, then our legal system can be able to deal. And of course, the legal system does not operate in isolation. The legal system needs a mechanism to be put in place. And I do agree with the submissions. I think it's Clifford who mentioned over the need for a standing office, a pandemic kind of office to deal with emergencies whenever they arise. It does not need to be, a whole kind of office like a parliament or a huge kind of office. We can have a lean office that can deal with that is a standing office, a permanent, but with very lean human capacity that is in constant contact nationally and globally, connected to other institutions that are dealing with similar situations within the nation, without the nation. And this can act as an early warning sign, so that we have early warning signs of any possible emergency that is going to arise. And it can also serve as a solution to, a country like Kenya, which is full of, I think this is Pavin who said, we are a region full of crises. We face one crisis after the other. And once we have all these issues captured in a legislation, and then we can also, compare what has been happening. For example, we've had someone mention about the DRC and Ebola. How have they been dealing with it? Are there best practices that we can learn from the DRC and Ebola and Uganda as well that has been affected before, that we can borrow in our legislation and therefore in our implementing framework that we put into place? So I do agree, as far as we still have all these concerns relating to the spread and dealing with the coronavirus and related pandemics, it still remains a moral question, and therefore creating the need to make it a legal question that can be enforceable under our laws. And to that extent, it is important that we have a standing office that can deal with these issues, that is in constant touch with expertise within the region, outside the region, and they can always act as a warning, to prepare us and come up with mechanisms on how to deal with these issues whenever they arise.
Thank you so much, Dr. Salah. And perhaps as we're wrapping up, is there anyone who, and this one I was really hoping...
Can I add something?
I'm really hoping that each one of you can weigh in on the question of whether anyone can shed light on the media reports relating to Chinese liability for causing the virus and engaging in cover-up or censorship. I'm not sure who this question has come from. I would want to dissociate myself. And, lest I'm accused of being of being the one introducing this particular discussion. But what do you have to say about that particular question? Because indeed we have seen it. We have seen some presidents also saying that very expressly. So what's your take on this? Maybe we could start with Clifford.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that's an interesting question. I'll try to be very careful how I answer it. I think first is to just say, I think the contribution on having this office, I think it's an interesting and very important suggestion, because one of the things that we find, I think we always think that having these offices require massive resources. In my opinion, it doesn't. A good example is the Kenya COVID Fund, where you have captains of industry who have been appointed by the president, and they're doing it pro bono. We don't, and they're giving their time and efforts and energies to be able to see how much they're raising. So I think it's possible to have some, this office, but it doesn't require, sometimes the way we say require billions to operate some of these offices. It's not necessarily the case. It's possible to actually have volunteers who are professionals in their own right, being able to add value to their country by running these offices. I think on the question you said about China, I think it's very difficult to put that kind of blame on one country, as in pandemics are things that
Clifford, remember the
affect
question.
all of
The
us.
question comes in. I think they have framed the question within the context of humanitarian action and the humanitarian effect.
Yes, and I think that I suppose the question was also in relation to whether the blame should be based on China, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and that's what I was saying. I think it's very difficult to put the blame on only one country. It's like saying on the issue of locusts, we should put the blame on Yemen, and therefore we should actually sue Yemen for not taking care of these locusts from leaving their country and blowing all the way the Indian Ocean, coming to Somalia. And in fact, we also sue Somalia because they were breeding in Somalia. And then it comes to Kenya. Then Uganda also sues Kenya because they also had some breeding ground in Kenya. So I think it's difficult. I think a pandemic is a pandemic, and because we are a committee of nations, we should avoid the blame game and say, look, if this came, the question is, how do we address it or attack it so that it does not go forward? But then how do we prevent it going forward? And maybe take the same sort of approach we did with SARS. I didn't hear anyone during SARS saying, we need to be able to sue China for the SARS pandemic that was sweeping across Europe. Yeah.
Aside from perhaps the inception or the genesis of the problem, I think there's also the other aspect of that has been raised in that particular query, the aspect of cover-up or censorship. And maybe just to move this now to Parvin, because I saw that she reacted to your analogy of or to the comparison with the locusts. So Parvin, what do you have to say about that? We need to hear you, Parvin. We need to hear you.
Sorry, I came from a public health background and very much, have experience in terms of dealing with different sorts of disease outbreaks. Yeah. So I'll pick cholera as an example. In Southern Africa, some of you might be aware. For instance, 2 years ago, we had a major cholera outbreak in Zimbabwe that spread to Zambia, that spread to Malawi, and Ebola last year. Clifford, you talked about Ebola, when there was some incidents of supposed incident. Let's be very careful in Tanzania. The government was not willing to share the information. Now, one of the things we really have to be cognizant of is that all our governments want to portray an element of being in control, so until that point at which, they feel, we are not able to manage this, that is when, we declare an emergency, we look for help. But that is our inclination as countries. Even in your own house, you won't, you'll try and struggle to manage the situation before you open it up to sort of the rest. And I'm using a very sort of layman, analogy. And that being the issue then is about shifting the focus to where it really should be. When it happens, what do we do? In terms of awareness, in terms of the mechanisms, and that is why, for instance, even at the global at the global level, World Health Organizations, UNICEF, the Center for Disease Control, structures, systems in place that are supposed to support both in creating awareness, of the concerns, and also looking at how we respond and working in, collaboration across different governments to do it. So recognizing, yes, that on one hand, in terms of information sharing, you might be careful to share until that point where you feel you are not in a position to manage it. Yeah, but that you are also obliged, especially because it is a disease, to share enough so that other people can be prepared, especially in this globalized world. Yeah.
Thank you. And Dr. Sala, there's a question here from Dr. Paul Ongedi, and he asks, and it links really to, and you can also comment on that while you're commenting on this other issue of China. The question of liability, the question of, even in terms of speaking about it, not just that it has come from, if at all, but also the aspect of the communication with respect to that, how we take care of people. So Dr. Ongedi asks, non-communicable diseases still continue to cause distress to many Kenyans, particularly affected dentists, surgeons, and many other healthcare specialists have suspended elective care procedures. Drugs, consumables, and supplies used in medical and dental care need to be zero rated to allow for continued efficient, safe care provision for all. He says unchecked costs of the healthcare inputs will result to a rising cost of healthcare. What's your take on that, Dr.
Yeah, well, let me begin by saying that
as you're also speaking to the justice, as you're also speaking to the aspect of justice with respect to China.
Yeah, maybe I need to mention that I didn't get your second question clearly. In the beginning,
the one from Dr.
Ongedi about liability, but then at some point it turned out to be more of a comment, and whether someone, my views on what should be done. It seems to be now a liability question. I don't know. Is it a liability question with regard to withholding of the essentials? Or is
the question as raised is actually more of a liability question, and that should we blame China? Should they be held to account? There have been media reports, and I think I've seen a case that has been filed.
Okay, maybe
with respect to that, so should China be held liable for this?
Let me talk about the China question, then perhaps we will talk about the other question later. About the China question, right. I believe in accountability. With my legal perspective, I believe someone must be held accountable. And when we talk about accountability, we are not talking about blame games. Yeah, it is US, it is China, it is Kenya. And we are not talking about conspiracy theories. Accountability has to be founded on legal, on true facts. Yeah. So I believe investigations have to be undertaken, and we need to find out the possible source of this particular pandemic. You know very well that the UN Charter prohibits against the use of biochemical weapons, and the Rome Statute also makes the use of biochemical weapons as an element that is prohibited as regarded as a warfare. Yeah, and actually, as we are speaking, there is an international NGO that has already sent a communication to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court seeking to hold China accountable. So the question of accountability for me is not debatable. Someone must be held accountable if it is found that actually it was out of their deliberate action. We cannot just be a responsive society waiting for pandemics to come from wherever, then we deal with it. Yeah, we also need to be proactive and stop those who are likely to cause these pandemics on us. Of course, Africa will end up being the recipients, and everyone will be trying out this and that, which the law actually refuses, and we have to be strong about it, come out strong about it. And if it's an issue of accountability, let us hold whoever is responsible accountable. Of course, I know it's going to be a difficult question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Salah. Because of time, I'll cut you short there. So then we can also hear John's take on that. So Dr. Salah leaves us with the fact that accountability is not a blame game. People need to be held to account, even if it's China or whichever country. John? You are not escaping the China question, John.
Okay. I don't know. I am a research person, and we don't speak when we don't have facts on the table. I think right now that conversation is still very at the political level. I think once it gets to the point that Pavin was speaking to, more from a public health conversation, and again, just as Dr. Salah is saying, more on the conversation of how do we prevent future outbreaks, I think it will get a bit more sane at that point. But I think where it is right now really is in a political mess. I think once we get the pandemic under control, I think conversations around how to prevent future situations like this will get a bit more sane.
All right, we hear you. We see how you're going around the entire issue. So because of time, I'll now give a few minutes to Brenda Wangila. Brenda, are you there? Brenda? All right, Gwen?
Oh, hello.
Hi, is this Brenda or Gwen?
This is Brenda.
All right, Brenda, please go ahead. You have 2 minutes to make your comments.
Okay, my comments are particularly on the purpose of humanitarian action during emergencies, whose core purpose is to protect life, but in doing so, we have to take account that it must do so in a dignified way. And because the coronavirus is actually a health crisis, but as the panelists have shown, it has far-reaching implications on the economy, on other sectors also. But looking at the right to health, there are minimum requirements that even in such a crisis, all the state actors and non-state actors must adhere to. And these are the social determinants of the right to health as captured under Article 43 on social and economic rights. And I'm glad to hear that Oxfam is actually doing something on that, on ensuring access to adequate food, on sanitation, on ensuring that people still have access to these basic requirements. But I would like to put across the point that humanitarian action must promote respect for human rights, and I saw that coming out in Dr. Salah's presentation. The access to justice mechanisms and the unlawful confinements may in the long term negate the objectives of humanitarian action. Yeah, that would be my contribution.
Thank you so much, Brenda, for that contribution. And indeed, you have raised very important issues, which our panelists have also spoken to. Do we have Gwen?
Yes, I'm right here.
All right. All right. Please take 2 minutes.
Okay, mine is on the fact that we, like it has been mentioned, we do not have the necessary funds to cater for this pandemic as a country. And my opinion would be, why not print the money that we need? Because if you look at money as an IOU, you can be able to print the money that we need in a way that won't cause inflation, but in a way that will be able to fund our needs, at least during this pandemic, and not enter into a financial crisis. And Clifford said something about ensuring corporates bounce back. And so as to ensure that corporates bounce back, banks need to survive. And how will banks survive? They need to have the money. So I think printing money is a solution that we can look at. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much for those comments to both our speakers. Now, in the interest of time, I'll just give a minute to each one of the panelists. Please keep it to a minute. And maybe while at it, you can also address the issue that has been raised about the printing of money. We could start with Pavin. Pavin?
Hi. My parting shot is there's definitely still a lot that needs to be done. We need to work together, all of us from the different areas, multi-sectoral. We have a lot to bring on board. So the journey, in my opinion, again, from public health is just starting. So we need to hunker in and get our support to the communities that need it most. I can't really speak to the issue of printing money because one of the things I think we've generally said is we need to monitor the potential economic impact that will come after this. So if that results in inflation or different things, we really have to be careful in terms of the strategies that we have that we put down. Dignity, there's something mentioned about dignity. I think that's part of the reason why we're talking about mechanisms. Are we doing cash transfers? What are the ways in which we get support to communities in a way that upholds their dignity? So that's definitely, those are things we need to consider. Thank you.
Thank you. John, parting shots?
Okay. I think for me is to keep in mind that the responsibility of safeguarding lives and the responsibility of making sure that those who are vulnerable are not left behind in anything that we do sits squarely in the laps of government. And so it's important, and I like the fact that many of us spoke to the accountability question from the media side, from the CSO side. And it's not just accountability in the way of we are going to harm a government, but it's more of how do we make sure that we are not leaving anyone behind as we put in place measures proactively for future emergencies, but also for what we are dealing with today. I think the responsibility of government has to be placed at the center of it, and how government reacts to this will have a very big effect on how we get out of how well we get out of the situation we are in right now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Asala. Your parting shot.
Thank you very much. I think I want to applaud this kind of discussion. I think the debate has just begun. I think we need much more of this kind of debate to enable us, come up with a robust kind of mechanism that can approach, the issue of dealing with emergencies whenever they recur. So I thank you for organizing this kind of discussion. Please organize many more, so that you can bring in a lot of, we have a lot of brain outside here that can chip in and make their contribution. A time has come when Kenya has realized that we need to stand by ourselves. We need to be independent and sovereign. We are sovereign state in the real sense of the word, yeah? So we also need to be sovereign whenever we are faced with emergencies and pandemics. And it begins by discussing, talking about it, bringing the brains together and actually actualizing the recommendations that come out of all this. So let this be a beginning. Let us have more of this kind of discussions and bring on the table the kind of solutions that we need our society to put in place in order to deal with emergencies. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Clifford?
I think my parting shot is just to say that I think emergencies is not only the role of government. Sometimes we forget to put the blame on only one institution. I think emergencies affect all of us, whether you're a development partner, government, academia, civil society. And I think what it takes you and me be able to come together, be able to find a solution on long-term disaster or long-term emergency preparedness. And I think we've had really fantastic discussions here today. The rubber always meets the road in terms of translating these conversations into real actions. And what I would urge all of us is to find ways in which some of the suggestions that have been made here can then be translated into real actions and bring together a sectoral approach on emergency preparedness. So it takes you and me to be able to take this forward.
Thank you so much for your comments and for actually being able to stick to time, and to our participants for being able to join us. Indeed, very many rich discussions and action points have come out from this particular conversation. And particularly this discussion has reminded us of certain things that we have maybe ignored in the past, the needs to work together, as every other panelist has said, stop the silo approach that we have to issues. Let us try as much as possible and work together. And also, as we have been reminded that we have great capacity and there's need that we tap into this capacity. And the need towards the end that that we have agreed on, the need to empower Kenya, Africa, make Kenya, also buy Kenya, buy Africa, buy our own industries, empower our industries, empower our people, because as has been highlighted, a community is only as strong as its weakest link. And if we are looking at even issues of humanitarian interventions, the question of how we define, are we able to raise the standards higher and higher, so then we are able to deal with as little problems as possible. So let's keep the conversation going through our various social media platforms. Let us continue to engage. For those whose questions have not been responded to, we will most certainly actually address them through the various platforms. Please note, as Dr. Sala and everyone else has raised, we need to keep the conversation going, and therefore there will be a webinar every Thursday from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. for the next 5 weeks. And of course, we'll share these details of these particular webinars on Twitter through Fiscal Law Africa. That's the Twitter handle. And to thank all the panelists once again, to thank our well-wishers and the sponsors, the contributors.